students. Well, afternoon by the time some of you will see this. It's the middle of the night. First race for all of you to drop some knowledge for class. So yesterday you looked at the Vietnam War, and the United States involved proxy war to fight the spread of communism. And we certainly will come back to that and talk about that war in some greater depth and detail and the consequences of that. But the war helps us also establish some context for some other things that the United States was doing in relation to the Cold War, communism during the same time period. So I want to kind of keep that context in mind as we talk about the space race, which is also very, very relevant given the fact for the first time since the United States has created another department of the government, and that is Space Force. President Trump has authorized that branch of the military to focus on the United States military activity in space. So I encourage you, if you have to Google it, if nothing else, giggle at the memes related to Space Force. But anyway, moving on, talking about the space race, one man, one giant leap for mankind. And our focus for this discussion will be two questions. Why did the United States create a space program in the middle of the Cold War? The Vietnam War was happening. The United States was engaged in an ideological struggle with the Soviet Union, so why get involved in creating a space program? And second, how did the space program impact U.S. culture and society? Because it had significant impacts in the 1960s, and of course still has really significant impacts on U.S. culture and society today. So I guess the question of why really starts with this little thing here, and that's the Sputnik satellite that the Soviet Union launched into space. Sputnik really didn't do anything. It was a satellite that orbited the Earth and it beeped, and that was it. But the thing that frightened people, particularly in the United States, was that you could actually hear Sputnik when its orbit went over your house. If you turn in your radio to the proper frequency, you could actually hear Sputnik beeping. And we have to understand in the context of the 1950s and this great fear about the nuclear arms race and the growing conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union, in this era of mutually assured destruction and creating bigger, badder bombs, this was pretty terrifying to the citizens of the United States. That, and it was just a technological victory for the Soviet Union. They took an object out of the world's atmosphere, put it into orbit. I mean, that took significant technology and understanding of physics and science. And a lot of people started to look at the United States as falling behind. Man, the Soviet Union is beating us. Not only did they develop nuclear weapons faster than we thought they could, but now they're putting things into space. So this had significant impacts in the United States in terms of education reform, and then also the push to actually put objects into space and eventually go to the moon. So the one thing that probably impacts us the most, and just thinking of us being students and teachers, would be the National Defense of Education Act in 1958. And this was a law that really revolutionized education and how Americans thought about education and what education should be used for. Prior to the 1950s, education was seen as something that was a creator of national culture. It was a place for immigrants to go to get assimilated, to learn English, to learn about American history. For many Americans, it was something that you did until 8th grade, 9th grade, and then maybe you went to work for your family. A lot of kids graduate high school, then went to work, but education wasn't necessarily seen as something that was preparing every American for a career. That was dedicated to a small percentage of people that might go on to college. But we know that shifted in the post-war era as particularly Army veterans got access to the GI Bill. More and more people started to go to college. And after the launch of Sputnik, a lot of American policymakers and politicians started to question, how ready our students were for entering fields of science and engineering. So the National Defense of Education Act increased funding for math and science education in the United States. What that meant was basically gave money to write curriculum to make it better, provide better materials and textbooks, train teachers and recruit more teachers in math and science education to try to increase an emphasis on math and science. The government gave grants to universities to conduct research on spaceflight and military technology. And here again, we get into that little bit of that military-industrial complex that we talked about. Building better bombs, but also building better technology. And a lot of our technology that we have related to flight in general comes out of the military, trying to make that better. And in particular, we talk about space travel. A lot of that came from universities that did all sorts of experiments related to the physics of how do we put something out in space. And then basically this was the STEM, the Science, Technology, Education, and Math initiative of the 1950s. The USA was losing to the Russians. So, we better catch up. And the picture of the book on the right is a study on the comparison of Soviet and American school programs. And you can clearly see, what Ivan knows, Johnny doesn't. And so Americans needed to catch up, because if we didn't, we were going to lose. Not only were we going to lose the space race, but we were going to lose the Cold War, and communism was going to become the preferred economic system around the world. So, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Act created NASA, which would be our sort of quasi-governmental agency that investigated space travel, space flight, and all things related to space. And from the law, there's a couple of excerpts here I find very interesting. Its role is the preservation of the role of the United States as a leader in aeronautical and space science technology and in the application thereof to the conduct of peaceful activities within and outside the atmosphere. And I underlined the phrase peaceful activities there because, remember, in the midst of the arms race and potential nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union, the United States wanted to try to emphasize that we weren't doing this necessarily to have a military presence in space, that the goal here was for peaceful activities outside the atmosphere. But that whole military presence in space thing was something that was kind of in the back of everyone's minds, particularly, what if the Soviets decided to put missiles on satellites that could be fired at the United States? So, the United States the Congress wanted to make it look like this was for peaceful activities, which in general it was. But there was also that element of, maybe we might need to do some military activities later. The second part I pulled out of it is the most effective utilization of the scientific engineering resources of the United States with close cooperation among interested agencies of the United States. And again, this was an act to kind of create the cooperation of scientific and engineering community, increase education, and promote those sorts of activities within the U.S. to catch up with the Soviet Union. So President Kennedy, we haven't talked much about President Kennedy yet, but President Kennedy took over for President Eisenhower in 1961. He was only president for a few years. We know he was assassinated in 1963. President Kennedy was president, though, during some key moments in the Cold War. He was very involved in decisions related to Vietnam and increasing troops there. He was, of course, president during the Cuban Missile Crisis when the United States nearly went to war, nuclear war, with the Soviet Union. But he also was the president that really outlined the United States' dedication to space flight and space activities. And so let's take a look at part of his speech related to the U.S. and NASA.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. If we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun.
I take out of that speech that line, we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And I think that really explains the United States' attitude towards space travel and the space race. You know, you heard Kennedy talk about, we're going to do all these things. Some of these things haven't even been invented yet. The parts of the space state, the alloys, the physics, the science didn't exist. But he committed the United States to putting a man on the moon because it felt if we can do that, then the United States can accomplish anything, and particularly defeat the Soviet Union. So the response to Kennedy's program or challenge was the Apollo program that sent 17 manned missions into space with the intention of landing on the moon. And Apollo 11 was the first to land on the moon, and then Apollo 12 and 14 through 17 also landed on the moon. And some people don't realize is that, NASA went to the moon several times. Of course, Apollo 13 was supposed to go to the moon, but famously didn't. There's a great film about it with Tom Hanks and Kevin Bacon, if you haven't seen it, about Apollo 13. But yeah, the United States took up the challenge of doing that, and especially again in that era of we don't really know what we're doing right yet. The spacecraft that was part of the Apollo program was pretty impressive for the time period. It was called the Saturn V rocket. It had a whole bunch of different parts to it. There was the actual engine and rockets, but just the very little, the very top here of the space craft of the rocket is what the astronauts actually used once it got into space. Everything behind lunar module down would fall off as it exited the atmosphere. It was completely a disposable spacecraft. And then once the astronauts were in space, they had to conduct some pretty impressive maneuvers to get this thing to work. Again, all in a environment that they had never experienced before.
These two spacecraft combined to become this one spacecraft. We're talking about transposition and docking today on Vintage Space. The need to connect the command service and lunar modules on the way to the moon and then have them separate and reconnect again was of course born from the decision to use Lunar Orbit Rendezvous as the mission mode for Apollo. Because only the smaller lunar module would actually be landing on the moon's surface, it had to have some way of connecting with the command service module with its larger consumables and fuel tanks that would be waiting for it in lunar orbit. And looking at pictures of the Saturn V rocket, we know that the two spacecraft didn't exactly leave the Earth in this lunar landing ready configuration. Instead, the command service module was packed on top of, when you're talking about a vertical rocket, the lunar module stored in an adapter section. This is the part of the Saturn V rocket that actually reached orbit. The S-4B upper stage, the lunar module packed in its adapter, the service module, and of course the command module. The S-4B stage had to stick around because this engine was the one that lit a second time to send the crew from the Earth to the moon on what's called the translunar injection burn. Only when the crew was on their way to the moon was it time to recover the lunar module from its adapter. This was a multi-stage process. The command module pilot would first separate this spacecraft using the small thrust rockets because if he had burned the main engine he would have fried the lunar module. To bring it around and then turn around, going very slowly and carefully, traveling less than a foot a second, he would guide the command module to the lunar module's docking port, connect the two spacecraft, and then draw the lunar module out. This docked configuration was then ready to go to the moon. But what's really interesting here is the actual docking mechanism. The docking probe was a three-pronged probe sticking out the top of the command module with three latches. The tip of the probe went through a hole in the conical drogue on the lunar module, at which point it would activate a pneumatic system actuated by nitrogen gas to move the latches from the cocked into the locked position. This in turn activated a probe retract system that drew the two vehicles together. At the same time, the lunar module's tunnel ring activated 12 latches on the command module to form a tight pressure seal between the two spacecraft. The newly created tunnel between spacecraft and the lunar module were pressurized through valves, and then once everything was equalized so there would be no explosive decompression, the probe and drogue mechanism was removed and the astronauts were able to pass through between the two vehicles. The whole process was done in reverse to separate the two spacecraft, freeing up the lunar module to make its lunar landing. After leaving the moon's surface, the lunar module would rendezvous and perform the exact same docking maneuver with the command module a second time, again opening up that tunnel so the astronauts would be able to transfer back into the command module. The transposition and docking phase, that initial capture of the lunar module before getting to the moon, was a vital phase because if for any reason the crew couldn't capture the lunar module, there was no mission. There was no provision to do an EVA to transfer astronauts between the two vehicles unless there was an emergency situation. But not being able to get the lunar module out of its adapter section would not be enough of an emergency to start doing EVAs to transfer into the vehicle just to save the lunar landing portion of the mission. And this is what almost just happened on Apollo 14. On a nominal mission, it took Command Module pilots just one try to dock with the lunar module. These guys were, after all, highly trained pros. But on Apollo 14, it took Stu Roosa 6 tries to dock with the lunar module, and it wasn't because he just wasn't good at his job. There was a problem with the latching mechanism, in that the command module would hit the lunar module's drogue and kind of bounce back, as Roosa described it. In the end, Houston had Apollo 14 perform a hard dock. He manually maneuvered the command module such that its docking mechanism was right flush against the docking ring on the lunar module. Then the crew manually retracted the docking probe, forcing the latches to engage and pull the two spacecraft together. It was a bit of a sketchy moment for NASA because no one was really sure whether or not the problem would resurface the next time the crew tried to dock the two vehicles, namely when the two moonwalking astronauts were returning from their stay on the moon's surface. But luckily, the problem did not resurface, and Apollo 14 had a very successful lunar landing mission. I've got a blog over on Popular Science that explains in more detail exactly how the docking mechanism between the command, service, and lunar modules worked, and what actually happened on Apollo 14's docking anomaly, so be sure to check that out if you'd like to know more. The link is below in the description. And of course, since we are talking about Apollo 14, this Sunday marks the 45th anniversary of that mission's launch, and
Okay, so you get the idea, and I show you that video because I think it explains just how complicated the science was behind actually making the spacecraft work. And she makes a good point, is that a lot of times they really didn't know. They had tested it, but I mean, you know, when you develop something on Earth, the physics and science behind that is completely different than what happens in space. So anyway, these were and this was, again, this was developed in just a few years. When you think about, you know, we went from not having a space program to having a space program to putting a man on the moon, all in the course of about 15 years, which is extraordinarily incredible. Which also meant that there was extraordinary pressure to succeed, you know, especially after President Kennedy gave his speech in late 1961 in 1961 about we're going to put a man on the moon. We had to succeed at that point. And so the United States government spent a lot of money, but there was an extraordinary amount of pressure on NASA to succeed. And there were lots of disasters and near disasters throughout the process. And you see over here, one of the testing of the lunar module was a major fire, and some astronauts were killed in the testing process. And of course, we think about the moon missions. We think about those guys and what they went through and their pressure. It was a great movie, First Man, that I think helps get this pressure to succeed across.
Hey, we got your spacecraft free indication here. What seems to be the problem?
We're rolling up and we can't turn anything off. We're continuously increasing the left roll.
CSQ Flight.
Go ahead, Flight.
Did he say he cannot turn the Agena off?
No, he says he's separated from the Agena and he's in a roll and he can't stop it.
Flight, their roll meter reads 270 and rising. At that rate, they'll be passing out in about 40 seconds.
Paul.
Sorry to stop the race. It certainly tough. RCS breakers. Are you initiating RCS? Jiminy, again, say you were closing RCS breakers. You will not be able to control your
Okay, we're regaining control of the spacecraft. Slowly at RCS direct.
Roger.
Roger, copy.
We're pulsing the RCS slowly. It's all roll right.
We're trying to kill our roll rate here. Move us back to 1 ring.
Copy.
I want emergency landing options. Wait until you find out how much fuel there's left. Bob, what do you think?
I think it's better land now.
Deke, Jan's outside.
So that clip shows that how dangerous the missions were to test this sort of technology. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Lightyear were sent into situations. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, not Lightyear, were sent into situations where NASA didn't really know what was going to happen. In that situation there, they almost died and in orbit and fell to Earth and didn't make it. There was an extraordinary pressure for these guys and NASA in general to actually follow through, and in some cases they put their astronauts in some very, very dangerous situations. Public reaction to the Apollo program was also very mixed. We can see over here in this chart money that was dedicated to these projects to actually make them work. So just for comparison, we see the Manhattan Project, which was the project to develop the atomic bomb. And you can see in $2008, so basically what a dollar was worth in 2008, we can see that at its height, the Manhattan Project cost pretty close to $10 billion in order to develop. In comparison, we look at the Apollo program and the extraordinary costs associated with that. At the height of the program in 1968, the United States was spending billions of dollars on putting men on the moon. In comparison, if we look at all of the Department of Energy technology programs from 1974 to 2008, they don't even really add up to the Apollo program. So because of that, there was really significant criticism of the Apollo program. And probably one of the most well-known criticisms of this was Whitey on the Moon by Gil Scott-Heron. It was a poem that was eventually turned into a song. And when you look at it, it really points out some of the public reaction, the criticism. So basically, you look at this guy. He's talking about, I've got all these problems. You know, a rat bit his sister. He can't pay his doctor bills. But Whitey's on the moon. And it was two things to this. First of all, you know, the government is spending all this money to put a man on the moon, but we have all these other problems. Like, we have all this poverty in the United States that nobody wants to talk about. In addition to that, there's a racial element to it. Looking at, you know, we're willing to spend all this money to put astronauts on the moon, but we have segregation, we have a civil rights movement that was happening at the same time, And the government, instead of focusing its efforts on social equality and social programs, was spending money on putting people on the moon. And at a lot of what people don't realize is that at some of these rocket launches, there were protests. There were people that were angry. There were people that didn't want this to happen, and they made it public and they made it known. And a lot of Americans, even, when you asked them about their reaction to Apollo, it was very mixed at the time. And even when we eventually landed on the moon, it was a big deal in the media, but to a lot of Americans, it was kind of like, all right, we landed on the moon. Great. Now what? And we have to kind of remember that in that context, is that there were a lot of other things happening in the United States. Again, the context of the Cold War, the civil rights movement was happening, and the United States was at war in Vietnam. And when you kind of put that all together, there was this sort of growing angst with the government and some of its programs, and how are we spending money, and is this the best use of our money at this particular point in time? NASA had a significant problem with civil rights issues as well. And if you take a look at NASA and where the research centers are, you'll notice that many of NASA's research centers are in the South, right? We've got several in Virginia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. And we have to understand that in the 1960s, these states were still segregated. So NASA had trouble recruiting African American engineers because their facilities were in the South. And why were these facilities in the South? They were there for a couple of reasons. Number one, the land was cheap. Southern property was available. The Kennedy Space Center, if you've ever been there, it's basically in a swamp. Same thing in Mississippi and Huntington, Alabama, and Johnson Space Center. I mean, there's just cheap open land there. Second, President Johnson was trying to bring some industry to the South. He was a Southerner himself, and wanted to sort of build up the economy of the South in terms of science, technology, and space travel. So, but the problem with that was that NASA had problems recruiting some of the best people, and some of the best people that they had weren't treated equally.
No more running. No more running.
Where the hell have you been? Everywhere I look, you're not where I need you to be. It's not my imagination. Now, where the hell do you go every day?
To the bathroom, sir.
To the bathroom. To the damn bathroom. For 40 minutes a day? What are you doing there? We're T-minus 0 here. I put a lot of faith in you.
There's no bathroom for me here.
What do you mean there's no bathroom for you here?
There is no bathroom. There are no colored bathrooms in this building, or any building outside the West Campus, which is half a mile away. Did you know that? I have to walk to Timbuktu just to relieve myself. And I can't use one of the handy bikes. Picture that, Mr. Harrison. My uniform, skirt below my knees, my heels, and a simple string of pearls. Well, I don't own pearls. Lord knows you don't pay colors enough to afford pearls. And I work like a dog, day and night, living off a coffee from a pot none of you want to touch. Excuse me if I have to go to the restroom a few times a day.
That was a scene from Hidden Figures, and it depicts the story of Katherine Johnson and some of the other women who worked for NASA as engineers. And it was actually Katherine Johnson and some of the other African American women that she worked with that developed most of the calculus and most of the math that made space travel available. Neil Armstrong used to talk about plans and they're going to test something. They used to run him the numbers and say, okay, if you do this, it's going to work. And then he would say, well, did Katherine Johnson test it? And the other engineers would look at each other and say, well, no. And he would say, well, I am not getting in that spacecraft and doing this test unless Katherine Johnson tells me it's going to work. But her experience there of having to use a segregated bathroom was part of the problem why NASA couldn't recruit some of the best talented people. And so, the people that worked for NASA certainly did fantastic things, but they struggled. And civil rights and segregation was something that would hold the United States back in the 1960s in a lot of ways, and also added to the criticism of the space program. Again, we have all these other social problems. Why are we spending money on going into space? Spaceflight also had a really significant influence on popular culture, and we can't talk about the impact of this, about spaceflight, without talking about this sort of an impact. Prior to the 1960s and 70s, some of the most popular movies in Hollywood were Westerns, and a lot of those movies were about, going west and fighting, like wild Native Americans and taming this place and adventure and, rogue cowboys and sheriffs in a lawless land. But by 1960, 1965, that sort of concept of the West had sort of played out. But people didn't really believe it anymore. It wasn't really popular. But space, on the other hand, was, as Star Trek put it, the new frontier. And as spaceflight becomes part of national culture, Hollywood starts to focus movies on science fiction and talking about spaceflight. And some of the first movies first sort of Hollywood productions that brought this to the attention were Star Trek, over here on the right, which is a television series on NBC, and Planet of the Apes, starring Charlton Heston, who was a huge star at the time. Which really focused on space travel and science fiction. The interesting part is that Star Trek, when it came out, wasn't super popular. It was only on TV for about 3 seasons, and it wouldn't be until later, in the late 70s and 80s, that it really becomes popular and it gets a reboot. And of course, there's been movies and reboots of different iterations of Star Trek. And Planet of the Apes really is one of the movies that kicks off this whole science fiction space travel genre, because it had a lot of the similar things that people liked about Westerns. We're talking about going somewhere where we're really not familiar. It's untamed. It's unknown. You have brave individuals who are willing to do this, and it really becomes a really popular genre. And of course, we can't talk about it without talking about Star Wars, probably one of the most profitable and well-known science fiction genres of all time. Of course, it has a lot of the same themes as Westerns and owes its success really to, this time period in spaceflight and space travel. And finally, we can't talk about the moon landing without talking about conspiracies, right? This was all made up by Hollywood. The eagle that never landed. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin did not land on the moon, right? Of course, it was all filmed in a Hollywood studio. There's a whole bunch of conspiracies about it, about landing on the moon, that, the moon rocks they brought back were fake, and there's no way they could have done that. When you look at the flag, it's all a hoax. Well, sorry, folks, the moon landing actually did happen. There's been dozens of investigations into the moon landing, and yeah, it absolutely did happen. When you look at the lighting and the way that things were filmed, there's no way it could have been recreated in a Hollywood studio given the technology at the time. So if you want to look into that a little bit more, you can Google it and search about moon landing conspiracies. But those are just people who didn't trust the government, and I think that's the important piece to take out of it. Why was there even this feeling that the government had lied? Well, because the government had been, not necessarily forthcoming about other things. The government had sort of hid its the amount of weapons it was creating. People didn't trust the government after the Cuban Missile Crisis and how that was handled. The government seemed to be maybe not telling the truth about Vietnam, and the government was spending billions of dollars on sending a man to the moon. So, maybe this was all just a lie, because if we didn't get there, then all that money had been wasted. So let's just film it in Hollywood and tell people that we landed. Well, for all you conspiracy theorists, sorry, we did land on the moon. So just to summarize what we're talking about here. So the space race summary. So, the space program was created as a response to the Cold War and the Soviet Union. Landing on the moon was a significant moral victory for the United States in the Cold War. Again, it wasn't really that big of a deal at the time in any other way. We kind of look back at it now as, wow, what an accomplishment that was, because it was. But it was more of that moral victory of like, hey, we can defeat the Soviets. It resulted in incredible contributions to science. It influenced popular culture, especially Hollywood. It changed our education system significantly, and our emphasis on maths and science education. But it also raised questions about government and spending priorities. And that is something that, as we get into this more modern period of American history, those are serious questions about what is our government spending money on and what are our priorities. And if you listen to any of the campaign rhetoric now, even in 2020, these same questions are being raised. What are our priorities? What are we spending money on? And why are we spending money on that? So the space race was, I find it very interesting. I think it's a great story and a great example of how the Cold War impacted not just our military and not just those wars, but impacted other areas of our culture during this time period. I'd like to thank Mr. Leopold for consulting with me on this PowerPoint in this lecture. If you don't know, he is a solar system ambassador for NASA. He has forgotten more about space travel and the space race than I know. So if you are really interested in this, go see him, go ask him some questions. He would love to talk to you about NASA and space travel and the science that goes along with it. So he is across the hall. He's usually in the hallway. He's got glasses. He's usually yelling things like violation. So go talk to him. He's a great resource. And hopefully I will see you tomorrow.